I want to begin today by reminding us a little bit of the beginning of the book and trying to take these admittedly probably the most philosophical and for some people therefore the most difficult portions of this book and put them back in the context of the book. So if you'll turn all the way back in the book to page 6 of the book, which is in the prologue. We remind ourselves that at the end of the prologue, Hannah Arendt writes, however, the modern age is not the same as the modern world. Scientifically, the modern age, which began in the 17th century, came to an end at the beginning of the 20th century. Politically, the modern world in which we live today was born with the first atomic explosion. I do not discuss this modern world against whose background this book was written. So it's important to understand for us trying to read this that she makes a distinction between the modern age, which is really the scientific age of the scientific revolution that begins with the event of Galileo's discovery of the telescope and has as its two main thinkers, Descartes and Leibniz. The purpose of the historical analysis, she says then, is to trace back modern world alienation, its twofold flight from the earth into the universe and from the world into the self, to its origins, in order to arrive at an understanding of the nature of society as it has developed and presented itself, at the very moment when it was overcome by the advent of a new and yet unknown age. So if we try and make sense of this, there are two parts of the book, right? There's the part in which she says, looks at the general human capacities which grow out of the human condition and are permanent, that is, cannot be irretrievably lost so long as the human condition itself is not changed. And those are labor, work, and action. And then there's a historical component of the book, which says that in about the 17th century, with the rise of the scientific revolution, a whole new age emerged, the modern age, which had two enormous consequences, which she calls world alienation and earth alienation. So chapters 3, 4, and 5 are about labor, work, and action. And then we hit this chapter called the Vita Activa and the modern age, which is not the modern world, but modern age. And so it's the scientific revolution. And so what this is, and this book is an attempt to understand the way that the scientific revolution has led to two things: earth alienation, the flight to the universal, and world alienation, right? The flight into the self, from the world into the self, and how these two things are challenging, threatening, and in ways creating unexpected problems for the human condition in which people labor, work, and act. And so we began chapter 6 last week, and we had a first chapter on world alienation. And that was about the way in which we lose the close at hand through mapping and through the expropriation of the peasantry from the land. And then the second chapter, chapter 36, which begins the question of earth alienation, which she says is even more important and more determinative of our world than world alienation. That's on page 264. When she says that, earth alienation has remained the hallmark of modern science. And if we remember the event of earth alienation is the discovery of the telescope by Galileo. And what does the discovery of the telescope by Galileo do? Well, on the one hand, it brings all things to our mind with the certainty of sense perception. But the sort of counterintuitive point that Arendt is making is that by making things certain to us on a micro level, on a telescopic level, we come to lose our faith in our ability as human beings to know and understand the world. It's actually a challenge to our senses, at least our senses as a matter of common sense. And thus, the triumph of the scientific age, which lets us know more and more and more, is always accompanied by what she calls the despair of the scientific age or the modern age, in which we are ever more acutely aware of the way in which we don't know and we don't fit into the world. This leads us to where we are, chapter 38, the rise of the Cartesian doubt. I assume many of you know about Descartes' idea that I think, therefore I am, and that I think, therefore I am is an answer to his idea of universal doubt, the doubting of everything. And from Arendt's point of view, Descartes' universal doubt, the doubting of everything, is the philosophical corollary of Galileo's discovery of the telescope. The telescope changed reality. It made reality something we can't trust, and we have to look always beyond the world we see in order to understand things. To understand the table, we have to look microscopically at the electrons and the wood and the composition. To understand the cosmos, we have to look again beyond our senses, but also to understand human relations. We have to look at the laws of psychology and the laws of economics and the laws of neurochemistry and biochemistry now that show us that the way we act isn't simply self-evident, isn't based on what we think and know as human beings in the world, but is something we always have to question. And so we end up with this kind of radical doubt. Now, for Descartes, the radical doubt is an attempt to solidify certainty. It's to lead to the one certainty that we can have, which is that I am. As she points out, Descartes doesn't actually prove I am. He proves that my thoughts are. And that's something she takes from Nietzsche. But in any case, he largely is an attempt to prove I am, and thus that I know something, and thus that in this certainty that I am, I can then go out and know the world as a modern scientist. That's the attempt of Descartes' philosophy to ground, in a sense, modern science. But it fails, Arendt argues, that what he really does and what science do, and they both work hand in hand in this, is that they lead to the loss of trust in the senses and in appearance of the world, and thus in truth. The point is that if all must be doubted, even the self-certainty that I exist is in the end only something I know in myself, in my mind. It's not something I know in the world. It's not something I know in reality. And so the world, in a sense, retreats. And all we can know is self-certainty, and not any truth about the world. This, she says, is a blow to human confidence. This is on page 276. And it shows us that humans are inadequate to receive or to know the truth of the world. these are complicated passages. I'm happy to talk about them, but that is the sort of core of what she wants to say in this chapter. That insofar as all I can know is what I think, where are my thoughts? They're in my head. I can know nothing truthful about the world. And thus, I can know nothing truthful about the reality. And so all I have left are the scientific virtues, right? What are the scientific virtues? Of hard work, diligence, and honesty. And so reliability becomes the virtue of the scientific age, that I'm reliable in my method of science, but I can never actually know anything about the true or objective world. Okay, we can always come back to it. Let me move on to chapter 39. So chapters 39 and 40 now try and take the insights that she has just offered from the analysis of Descartes and Galileo and apply them to the world. So remember the context that this whole chapter on the Vida Activa in the modern age is within, which is the context of world and earth alienation. World alienation is the retreat from the world into oneself, and earth alienation is the retreat from the earth into the universe. And the claim here is that Cartesian introspection. What does introspection mean? The spection is to look around inside. We stop looking around out there in the world and we look inside for our truth. It's the retreat from truth in the world to truth in our head. And this Cartesian introspection begins us on this path of seeking truth in ways of thinking, logic, and not in a common shared world. And so man concerns himself, she says on page 280, long before the natural and physical sciences, this is about 8 or 9 lines into the chapter, began to wonder if man is capable of encountering, knowing, and comprehending anything except himself. Modern philosophy had made sure in introspection that man concerns himself only with himself. I am. That's the beginning. And everything else follows from that and is on the basis of an internal introspective thought. Now, the first part of that sentence may seem strange to people, but if you look at the footnotes throughout these next 2 chapters, you'll see that a lot of the footnotes are to 17th, 18th, 19th, and even 20th century scientists. And her argument, overarching argument, is that that Descartes' turning inward, the world alienation from the world to the self, has been mirrored and has been adopted by natural and physical science, such that what scientists study is not the world that appears, but is simply the world as it hits upon our senses and as it lives in a logical universe, a thinking universe. Those of you who know the uncertainty principle, that is a big part of what she's talking about. And she cites Heisenberg repeatedly throughout these 2 chapters. The idea being that we set up an experiment to measure and find what we are looking for. We find what we're looking for, and therefore we say that's how the world exists. It's actually not engaged with looking the world and trying to understand it. It's trying to see if the world fits into our mathematical, logical theories. And the result of that, the reason for that is because we all know that we can't trust the world. We have come to be suspicious and doubt our senses, and thus the reality of our bodily sensual existence. And so we have become increasingly internalized. So much so that our entire thinking about the world, philosophically and scientifically, has become internalized. And so if you continue to read there, right after the footnote, man, in other words, this is again on 280, man, in other words, carries his certainty, the certainty of his existence, right? I think, therefore I am, within himself. It's within himself, not outside himself. The sheer functioning of consciousness, though it cannot possibly assure a worldly reality given to the senses and to reason, confirms beyond the doubt the reality of sensations and of reasoning, that is, of reality of processes going on in the mind, right? Not anything about the outside world. We see, she says at the bottom of this paragraph on page 281, the seen tree, right? The last sentence. The seen tree may be real enough for the sensation of vision, just as the dream tree is real enough for the dreamer, as long as the dream lasts, but neither can ever become a real tree. We talk about what we see and what we dream, but we don't talk about reality. And this then leads to, as Christo was just asking, a kind of nihilism in the sense that we also doubt the goodness of the world. The point here is that we doubt that the world has any sense or meaning. We ask, well, if the world really is simply in our heads and we're making it up, then how can it be a purposeful, good world, right? This is the theological question of what's called a theodicy. Is there a truth to theos, a dikere, a truth to God? Did God create the world so that it would be good? And this becomes a problem because if we might have been deceived forever, it's not at all clear how the world that we're in has any particular goodness to it. The result of this that I think is there's a lot of intricate points here, and I don't want to get lost in them, but the result of it and what's important for us to remember, and this is on 283, right, is that Cartesian reason, this is the top of 283, is entirely based on the implicit assumption that the mind can only know what it has itself produced and retains in some sense within itself. Since anything we sense from the world can be deception and can deceive us, all we can really know is what we make, is what we produce. And thus the only thing we truly trust is pure logic or mathematics. But notice, not mathematics as the ideal forms given outside the mind, that's called geometry, not geometry, but algebra. Only the forms of mathematics and the mind that are purely abstract and symbolic. And that she then cites Alfred North Whitehead, who's someone she cites a lot throughout this book, and his book Science in the Modern Age is without a doubt an essential book to read if you really want to understand Hannah Arendt, I think, who writes that the outcome of common sense is the outcome of this modern scientific theory and this modern philosophy is that common sense is in retreat. And here's where she brings in the word common sense, which is an essential word for anyone who wants to understand Hannah Arendt. Common sense is the sixth sense, right? We have five senses: hearing, seeing, touching, smelling, whatever the fifth one is. And common sense is the one that unites them all together, gathers them together. And it helps us understand the world that we see. But she says it fits us into a common world. The sensus communis, which is an Arendtian term that she takes from Immanuel Kant in some of her later work, is an attempt to talk about what is it that holds us together in our judgments and our sense of what's right and wrong about the world, what's beautiful and not beautiful, what has good taste and bad taste. And what we increasingly have in common is not the world, she says, but the structure of our minds, right? Which, of course, is not something we can have in common because each one of it is our minds. And so, as she says in footnote 44, the transformation of common sense is into an inner sense, and it is characteristic of the entire modern age. The last chapter on thought and the modern worldview, again, these three chapters, it's good that we're reading together. They all go together. The point is that we have, in removing ourselves from looking at and thinking about the world, which we no longer trust because it's deceptive, into ourselves, we remove the Archimedean point from anywhere in the universe into ourselves, into the mind of man. And when we do that, we free ourselves from any given reality, from given reality altogether. That is, from the human condition of being an inhabitant of the earth. It is both world and now earth alienation. We exist almost in a vacuum, which is why people like Ray Kurzweil and many of the transcendentalists and transhumanists now are arguing that, we are part of a singularity with the universe, right? That when we succeed in merging man with machine, and when we succeed in creating man as a purely thought entity without a body that exists maybe in a computer, but in the end is really simply just at one with the intelligence of the universe, which is a quote from Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, we will become unearthly. We will become part of a hive mind that is the intelligence of the universe. That will be, for Kurzweil and for the transhumanist, the ultimate triumph of science, because it will free us from all deception of physical reality and lead us to a pure, universal thought. Right? That's, I've said this before in this course, but I take Kurzweil with incredible seriousness, not because I think he's always right, but because he has a philosophy and a religion and a worldview that is I think, logical conclusion of the modern scientific age. And it is the pure internalization of all reality such that we become pure thought. And that pure thought triumphs, and yet it doesn't lead to a certainty about the world. And thus, and this is where I think Kurzweil falls short, we still need the deus ex machina of Descartes. We still want to live in a world. And yet his goal is to fully exit it. And so this chapter is about thought and the modern worldview, in the sense that thought becomes the driving force, such that our drives and our desires are to actually remake the real world, the actual world, according to different thoughts and theories. Right? So, if the human body is not a good enough shell for us, we want to, through nanotechnology and genetic technology and neurobiology, rewire it with drugs and implants, etc. If the earth has environmental problems and is not a good enough earth, we want to, in a sense, replace the dirt of the earth with nanotechnology dirt that pulls up carbon dioxide, right? This is what people are working on now. We want to replace the rivers that maybe are too polluted with self-cleaning water, right? And this, I think, I think it's undoubtedly true that all of this is going to happen in the next 20 and 30 years. And so what Arendt is saying is science has ceased trying to understand the world, and it's more and more about making the world in our image conform to how we want it to conform. And that this is deeply, deeply rooted in the modern scientific age. I mean, she wrote this, remember, in 1958. I mean, this is stuff that Heisenberg and Schrodinger and a few other scientists had really started to think about, but she was the first non-scientific thinker, I believe, who really began to understand this and understand it in a meaningful cultural and philosophical and political way, in a way that she saw threatened the human condition of labor, work, and action, because it threatened to remake what humans are and how humans are as earthly and worldly beings, subject to chance, vagaries, and the givenness of reality. On page 287, she writes, Cartesian doubt, logically the most plausible and chronologically the most immediate consequent of Galileo's discovery, was assuaged for centuries through the ingenious removal of the Archimedean point into man himself. Namely, we had doubt, but we then had certainty about ourselves, at least so far as natural science was concerned. But, right, here's the but, the mathematization of physics, such that physics doesn't look and try and understand the world, but tries to, A, reduce the world to mathematics, but then, of course, the opposite is true, mathematically figure out what the world is, and then test the world to see if it fits with our theories. The mathematization of physics, by which the absolute renunciation of the senses for the purpose of knowing was carried through, we no longer need the senses at all, had in its last stages the unexpected and yet plausible consequence that every question man puts to nature is answered in terms of mathematical patterns to which no model can ever be adequate, since one would have to be shaped after our sense experience. This is a key point. The models that we now have for the universe, whether it's string theory or quantum physics, etc., simply are not adequate and not comprehensible by the human senses, because they're not from our human senses. And they are from a mathematical structure that has no bearing on how we as humans experience the earthly world. And it's at this point that the connection between thought and sense experience, inherent in the human condition, takes its revenge. Right? We suddenly no longer have this connection, being and appearance part company for good. And then at the bottom of the page, she can write, scientists formulate their hypotheses, right? We have an hypothesis, string theory, to arrange their experiments. We test for it, and then use the experiments to verify their hypothesis. During this whole enterprise, they obviously deal with a hypothetical nature. You actually never deal with nature. You deal with nature as seen through the experiment, which is why Heisenberg says in modern physics, man never encounters nature, he only encounters himself. And Arendt is taking that Heisenberg insight and combining it with her reading of Galileo and Descartes and saying that they're all connected in this basic experience of world alienation and earth alienation that has its origins in the scientific age, the scientific revolution. She cites in footnote 51 Erwin Schrodinger, and it's worth reading that footnote. As our mental eye penetrates into smaller and smaller distances, right, micro and nano technology, and shorter times, we find nature behaving so entirely differently from what we observe in visible and palpable bodies of our surrounding that no model shaped after our large-scale experiences can ever be true. No humanly thought model based on a language that is grounded in senses and human experience of the world can be true to the mathematical scientific reality. Thus, we have then a divergence between the visible appearing world and the true world, being an appearance part company. And on the next page, on 288, the first sentence, she says, in other words, the world of the experiment seems always capable of becoming a man-made reality. Right? We can actually make the world of the experiment, the being world, the true world, real. And this, while it may increase man's power of making and acting, even of creating a world, we can make the world new in our image, like God's, right? And far beyond what any previous age dared to imagine or dream. It puts man back once more into the prison of his own mind. The point is, again, we create a world from out of our mind, not in the world we're in. This is the alienation of man from a common world into an individual world, which is the root, as we were talking about earlier, of world alienation and thus homelessness, rootlessness, which leads to the ideological power of modern ideologies, because what ideologies offer is a sense of place and purpose in a world that makes simple sense, even if it doesn't conform to the complexity of the true world.